I'm Jess Barrow, and this is the Ed Voices podcast. We're here today with two folks from the Family Engagement Lab, Elisabeth O'Brien and Megan Lorio. And I'm going to turn it over to them to say a little bit about themselves before we dive into a really fun conversation around family engagement, why it's so important for teachers and districts to engage families around student learning, and how students can really benefit from that kind of engagement. Elisabeth, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jess. And Meg and I are really excited to be here and to have this conversation and share more. I am one of the co-founders of Family Engagement Lab and also our Chief Impact Officer. And I lead a lot of our research and evaluation work. And I sort of started in education as a bilingual school psychologist. And this work is sort of personally, motivating and, very important to me too, as a mom of two young kids. So really looking forward to sharing just how important family engagement and learning is as part of the conversation today.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jess, for having us here today. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I am Megan Lorio. I am the managing editor at Family Engagement Lab. So I do a lot of our content and curriculum work and really thinking about working towards our mission to empower families and their child's learning. And I am based in New Orleans. I'm a mom myself too, to two little girls. I'm also a former teacher. I was a kindergarten teacher for 7 years and then a school administrator for 4 years. So excited to kind of bring that background into the conversation as well today, and talk more about this important topic.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited to hear not only about your experiences and perspectives, but all the expertise you bring around this topic and the work you both are doing. I think it might be a good place to start if we sort of zoom out a little bit and just in general talk about why it's so important for schools to engage families around student learning.
Great. I can sort of start here. I think what's really important in terms of a place to sort of begin looking is that there's a lot of data and research about the impact of families supporting learning at home. And that sort of robust and growing literature base highlights, very a wide range of benefits for students, from academics to behavior, social and emotional skills, graduation rates. And I think what's really interesting today as like school and district leaders are grappling with things like chronic absenteeism, teacher retention, that those are also things that strong family engagement can help support. Another, I think, really key factor here is that family engagement learning is a solution that really centers equity. And I love this quote from a research study that showed that parent involvement in at-home learning has more than twice the effect on student test scores than parents' education level or socioeconomic status. So just this powerful solution that really is accessible and critical for all families. I think one more thing to note here too is it's what families are really interested in knowing. They want to know about their children's learning experience. And when we've sat down with families consistently, we hear families say, like, I want to know from my child's teacher, like, what is my child learning? Are they on track? And how can I help at home? And so, in addition to it being so impactful to engage families, families are really eager for that information.
Yeah, completely agree. And just to sort of build off of that, one research statistic that I think is super interesting is that at 9 out of 10 families think that their child is on track academically. And we know that the gaps are much larger than that. So it's really clear that many families are not receiving regular information about student learning and grade level milestones. So teachers are the trusted experts. Like families consistently need that high impact information so they can best support their child's learning. So we really need to make sure that families have high expectations when it comes to learning. So do families really understand what their child should know at any point in the school year? Do they have examples of what that might look like and sound like? Really bring some clarity to some of these milestones and sort of expectations is super, super important for families.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you both for sharing a lot of the clear sort of the why behind this big topic that I think people might have experienced in bits and pieces, but I think is so important to kind of put together. Um, I wonder if we think about getting a little more granular, like what are some of the different ways schools and educators can effectively engage families? Because I'm sure there are a lot of different approaches, and you all have a lot of expertise on sort of what might work. I know it's different everywhere, but what might work better? What are some best practices?
Yeah, great question. So I think that when we talk about sort of family engagement, high impact family engagement, really, we know that the cornerstone of any kind of family engagement strategy is understanding the community deeply and building authentic, trusting relationships with families that are based in two-way communication. So asking questions like, how can we bring families into processes like goal setting and supporting their child's learning? Um, and really recognizing that families themselves have varied experiences when it comes to schools. So that's why that trust and that relationship part is so important. We can sort of recognize the funds of knowledge. Like families have so much information that they can provide teachers and schools about their child. And so really seeing the assets there and recognizing those funds of knowledge to sort of ask more questions, right? So tell me about your hopes and dreams for your child, or what motivates your child, or do you have what you need from us to support your child's learning? Those types of questions really help to build that trusting partnership that we're looking for. And it's just really at the foundation of any kind of family engagement strategy. Um, we also think a lot about how to make sure that family engagement practices are inclusive. So often our most underserved communities really aren't getting the information that they need. So families speaking a language other than English get a lot less engagement and information historically. So really reflecting on in any kind of practice that we're using in schools, is what we're doing accessible to all families or just to some, including thinking about language and translation needs is really important as we sort of design our family engagement strategies in schools.
Yeah, and I know, Megan, you had mentioned you have a lot of, you have firsthand experience with this from your time in the classroom, like really seeing how this impacted students and families when you put some of these things into place and when you were able to really meet families where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very fortunate that very early on in my teaching career, I received a lot of professional development around family engagement, and sort of, some of these high impact practices. So, conducting home visits, explaining academic data to families. That was sort of something that I did very early on in my teaching career, and I saw the impact of that in the classroom. Really, when I felt like I was building not only a classroom community, but a broader community that included families and really brought them in. That's really where I saw students thrive.
Elisabeth, what about you? What do you, from your perspective and your experience, what are some ways that are really important for being effective in the way families are engaged?
Yeah, I think, sort of drawing upon what Megan was sharing around accessibility, something that's really important too is making sure you're sharing like right sized information about what students are learning. So I often see these like newsletters or a family worksheet, and it's just pages upon pages of information, and just thinking about the limited time that so many families have, that is hard to digest. And then also, to Megan, to your point around the translations, it's often available in English and Spanish, but we know that our communities have, way more linguistic diversity. And so that becomes an access issue as well. But I think that piece around just right sizing the information so that families can access it and act on it is essential. And at Family Engagement Lab, we have our tool FASTalk, which stands for Families and Schools Talk, and that was what we're trying to do with FASTalk. So basically help teachers send home learning activities via text in each family's home language that directly relates to what's happening in the classroom, so families get that information. They don't have to just ask like, what did you learn today? Oh, nothing. They have information like, I know that you're, gearing up for a debate about the American Revolution, or, you're practicing fractions, and, there's an opportunity to embed some of that into laundry. So I think we're trying to create an opportunity for families to get that quick, right size information that they can incorporate some of these learning focused conversations and activities really seamlessly into their day-to-day life.
That's great. And I think yeah, making sure, I mean, as a my daughter's only 3, so not school age yet, but I already feel overwhelmed by all the moving parts. So I can imagine navigating through so much at the school level, having that sort of bite size but very clear and very actionable information. And fast talk is a great way to do it. and I'm sure there are other ways schools can think about doing it as well. Um, we talked about in general why it's important to engage families, and then sort of some of the ways that can effectively be done. Um, how do you all think about, you know, if we break these groups down, like families, teachers, and students, what are some of the ways that more information about instructional materials and curriculum that's so connected to student learning, how does that benefit those three groups?
Yeah, sure. I can start by sharing a little bit about how it benefits families. So, if families are regularly getting that information about like what their children are learning, they can really reinforce that at home. There are opportunities throughout the day to be making those connection points, but if families don't have that information, that they won't be able to have that opportunity. Also, just I've been reading about how important it is to be making sort of these relevant real world connections, and showing kids too that what they're learning has a lot of importance like beyond the classroom, and families are just so well situated to help make those connection points. So they know what their children are interested in. They know what's going to really get them activated and involved. And so when families can layer on that meaningful information, it's going to help bring it to life for students as well. And I think we just don't want families to have to like miss those opportunities, and so the ability for families to get that information regularly is just so important. And then I think one other sort of another strand around benefits for families too is we've seen that when families get more information about the curriculum and what exactly their kids are learning in class, like their views can become more positive about the curriculum and what children are learning, because they have more of an understanding, like breaking it down. And so I think that's been something really important too. Like families aren't in the dark around, what's happening every day in the classroom. They're really looped in and seen as real partners in supporting student learning.
That's such a great point. I mean, I feel like it's materials in and of themselves can feel very inaccessible, especially if that's not your background or you're not an educator. And so being able to really give that information to families in an accessible way is a great entry point, since their students are going to be engaging with that content every day. Um, Megan, what about teachers, and sort of from your experience as a teacher, but also what you see? I know you're often working with teachers in your current role too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, Elizabeth kind of just talked about some of the benefits to students, right? And so just inherently in that, there's a big benefit to teachers, right? Like I think that this type of communication, um, whenever a student can be making connections inside the classroom and outside the classroom, really that can enhance learning, especially around sort of knowledge building and some of the curriculum topics that are being addressed in the classroom. It's also really true that the more a teacher knows about their students'
Yeah.
backgrounds, the more relevant that they can make their instruction and the content in the classroom itself. So, really sort of thinking about those connections between a teacher and a family, it only enhances sort of what the teacher is able to do in the classroom to make that curriculum content more relevant to students. It also, there's a lot of conversations around teacher time, teacher burnout. So sort of thinking about how can families provide extra support. We know that families can play a really critical role in moving the needles for students around student success and student learning. So how can we bring families into that so that they can provide that extra support for students? Just another resource to support students in meeting their goals.
Yeah, Megan, I love that you highlight how understanding your students and the community and their families can help teachers make the content more relevant, because that's something that we're thinking a lot about at Ed Reports. That hasn't always been a traditional focus in terms of like the importance of culturally relevant materials for students and for their academic performance, but also their sense of belonging and engagement in school. So, really pairing all of that together. Sometimes materials don't, they're designed for a national landscape, right? So they may not have everything that an individual community would need to make that relevant, but that is a place where teachers and understanding the families and students can really add that and make those adjustments. So I appreciate that mention. Elizabeth, I know you already touched on a lot of benefits to families overlapping with students. Is there anything else you'd want to highlight around the student piece that you think that we haven't quite touched on yet?
Yeah, and I think, as each of these sections they're very interconnected, the benefits for families and teachers and students. And so, something that I also think we observe and hear from the teachers we work with is that, kids who have had a conversation with their families, maybe the night before, that week, about a topic that, you know, is going to be discussed in class the next day. Teachers say, like, kids are coming more confident, like they're sharing new ideas. They've had that opportunity to sort of practice and get more information from their families. And so I think that's another piece where it's like it affects the child's learning, the dynamics in the classroom, and just really just emphasizes how valuable families can be in the process. And I also think just another piece around the connection with families and student learning is that families can help increase that motivation. So by making those real world connections, like that's going to keep children really engaged in the content. And then, linking to what I had said initially, just the research about the academic gains. Like, we know that family engagement affects student learning. And so you just that ability to make those connection points has really long-term positive benefits for kids.
We've talked through sort of the big why behind this, some strategies for effectively engaging families, why, like what the research says, what your experience says about how this can benefit so many groups who are interconnected. I can imagine that this probably goes on to varying degrees depending on what your school community is. And if there are educators and districts out there who really want to engage families more than they have been, but they might not know exactly where to start, um, are there resources? I know we've talked a little bit about some already. We can elaborate more, but are there resources you might recommend to them as they get started?
Sure. Yeah, I can sort of start by talking a little bit about FASTalk. So, sort of thinking about sort of how that could transfer into a lot of different types of tools. But something that we do with FASTalk is really focus, like Elisabeth was talking about, on making learning accessible and actionable for families. So, really trying to answer the question, like, what is one small thing that a family could practice in the car or in the waiting room in the doctor's office that could reinforce key grade level skills? So much of the information that families receive about learning isn't necessarily actionable. So, really setting some goals, if you're a teacher, setting some goals to really think about how to weave in activities that build families' capacity and confidence to support learning. I also think, kind of getting past the jargon. We were kind of talking a little bit about this, but, whenever we're thinking about making something actionable, accessible, I know as educators, it's easy to kind of speak the language, but families oftentimes really don't have a window into what that means. So, really thinking about resources, providing resources that kind of get beyond some of the more academic education sort of jargon and really focus on information that families are going to be able to digest and understand and lead to a really positive interaction with their child around learning.
I think that's so important. And I think, we haven't gotten too deep in the weeds of how this connects to instructional materials, but I think it's very much implied like this is around the content in the classroom that the students are learning. And so much of that is, or is hopefully based around a really strong core curriculum. Um, yeah, Elisabeth, are there other resources that FastTalk is such a great one, and Megan, you gave so many great examples of how that can be used in different ways. Are there other resources that you have encountered that you think could be helpful to schools and districts?
Yeah, I think something that Megan and I often share with educators and school leaders when we're talking just sort of about the power of family engagement and learning and connecting family engagement to that curricular piece is just helping leaders and educators with like action planning. So, really narrowing down on a goal that they would like to accomplish in a certain set of time. And we sort of walk through this process of thinking about, like, what's going well right now in your school community and why. So it's sort of linking to what we've spoken today about how, like, understanding your community is essential to identifying the right goal and having that right strategy. And then also really thinking about, like, prompting folks to recognize, like, you can't do this alone. Who do you need to collaborate with? And family engagement is inherently very interdisciplinary, and so just thinking about, like, are there folks at the district level, teaching and learning, and family and community engagement, office of equity, like, everyone should be around the table as we're thinking about how to get really high impact family engagement strategies and work off the ground. And also, we will talk with folks around, like, just identifying what are the resources that you need, from the language point of view, and like, what are translation interpretation needs, like, what are reading levels that you need to consider as you're trying to make that curricular resource really accessible for families. And then just thinking more about, like, how can you sustain and scale the plan? So it's not something that happens like one fall, but yeah, it's something that keeps going. And then walking through a timeline, I think it's just wonderful. I think too, to give folks the space to have some of that thinking, and I think it's not something that teachers often have very much time to do. And I think that's another really important part of this conversation, is that, like, recognizing that family engagement takes time, and teachers don't have one more minute. So how can we, as like a system or school building, be thinking about ways that, like, family engagement for teachers is a really high priority, and we're going to make the space and time to let that happen, and for teachers to really engage and connect with their students' families.
Yeah, no, that's all such good information. Is there, as we wrap up, is there anything that I didn't specifically ask about today, or anything around this topic that you would want to express before we head out?
I think I would just say that family engagement is complex because it deals in relationships, right? Like you're saying earlier, so much of this is about relationship building. So really just recognizing that it's a journey, not a destination. Even just thinking about one small thing you can incorporate to help families have more access to the learning that's going on into the classroom is really meaningful for families. So really just taking it one step at a time, setting smaller goals around family engagement can be really helpful. And I would just encourage teachers to try that out.
And we'll just to note, we will include all these mentioned resources and information in our show notes. So we'll make sure all of this is accessible. And if you're watching or listening, you'll be able to easily access all of the resources that Elisabeth and Megan mentioned.
Yeah, wonderful. And sort of, I think a final thought that I have too is just, Megan shared her experience as a teacher and really getting this both, like, pre-service and in-service sort of training and support around family engagement and learning. And that is not common. And I think that that's another area and, like, need we really see in the field. And so, if teachers are entering the schools and, their positions as teachers, having had, like, 30 minutes of one class focus on families, they're going to need, to build that capacity, the knowledge, the skills to be able to really effectively engage families in learning. And so I think just the more we can think about professional learning opportunities and the places and spaces that teachers already are, as they're talking about the curriculum, how can family engagement be a piece of that? And just thinking of, like, the lens through which families can also be really actively involved in the curriculum. So I think that's another area that is super important in this space.
I could not agree more. Well, thank you both so much for coming on, sharing so much of your knowledge and your personal stories. I know we're going to be working together more in the future as well. So just look forward to more chats and more learning from you, and really trying to um, spread the word around family engagement and how important this is for educators and families. Um, Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.